This interview with Valdeen Sheers was part of a series entitled Using Judicial Review to Promote Access to Justice for All. Valdeen Sheers is a journalist, mother of 7, and a survivor of intimate partner violence. She's now engaged in advocacy work in Trinidad and Tobago, her home country, to end violence against women. In the interview, Valdeen talks about the abuse she suffered at the hands of her partner. She also discusses the obstacles she faced as she sought to use the justice system to protect herself and her children. Welcome, Valdeen.
Thank you.
You're joining us at the end of our judicial review training series titled Using Judicial Review to Promote Access to Justice for All. Over the course of several sessions over several months, we've been learning some of the nuts and bolts of using judicial review as a mechanism for promoting access to justice. In this, our last session, one of our central aims is that we might, as lawyers and social justice advocates, focus that knowledge on promoting access to justice, particularly in the context of gender-based violence in the Caribbean. We think that it's critical for us to learn about some of the shortfalls in access to justice for survivors. Valdeen, you are, among other things, a survivor and human rights defender and an advocate. We're very grateful to have you here with us to help us to reflect on how we might employ survivor-centered approaches as we try to improve access to justice in the context of gender-based violence.
Thank you for having me.
So Valdeen, you are, as I've mentioned, a human rights defender and an advocate for change in relation to the law and policy in Trinidad and Tobago pertaining to domestic violence. Tell us about how you became an advocate.
Becoming an advocate was sort of at the time I didn't realize, but it was my own way of self-healing. And why I say that is because I started quietly for advocating, would have been in 2012, when I joined an international blogging site called World Pulse, which is accessed by about 190 countries across the world. If it's not all female, it's predominantly female. And a lot of them, they speak about genitalia mutilation in African countries and the rights, the lack of rights to women in Saudi Arabia, and these kind of really serious things that tend to make bigger headline news. But I felt like Trinidad and Tobago had too many cases of domestic violence, homicide, murder and murder-suicide, and not enough was being done to better protect victims and survivors of, at the time it was called domestic violence. And I was still in my marriage because this was 2012. And I decided, because my ex-husband wasn't if I am a technical dinosaur, I don't think he was like caveman. So he didn't know anything about computers. And because I'm a journalist, I spend most of my time on the laptop or the computer anyway. So it was easy for me to be able to blog and him to just think I was writing another article to make an income. And he had no problems with that once it was to make an income. So it was my way of quietly advocating against what I was experiencing and what I know countless other citizens were also experiencing. So I joined that site and I wrote my first piece talking about my fears, and then and the name on that site, my name is Spiritual Survivor. And from there, I stayed in the relationship. So 2012, the following year, I was in a shelter for a brief time. And then I went back to the relationship. So it was sort of like a roller coaster ride from then onwards until end of 2016. And my advocacy from there went into, again, I quietly advocated. When I started to write my book, um, at the time, the title of the book was From Behind Mental Bars, because I was still in the relationship. And then I changed the title to Free from Mental Bars. So it's unpublished. It ought to be published and launched next year, early next year, which is next month actually, sort of. Um, so, and the book talks about spiritually, it talks about the abuse and spiritually surviving abuse. And so that was my quiet ways where I still didn't have my voice yet to advocate. Because on the blog, I spoke about the need for the electronic devices. I spoke about the need to add more teeth to the protection orders. I spoke about things that I wanted to see happen because of the shortcomings in the system for me. Even though I wasn't out, even though I had never made a report on him really, except because the following year is when I made my real first official report on him as far as domestic violence is concerned. And then my actual advocacy started when I came out, and that would have been at the end of 2016. Again, we had a family crisis, which led to him. Actually, he was arrested for his criminal activities, and that gave me a chance to be able to go to the police station and follow through. Not just go to the station and then stay in the home with him afraid, because that's what I was worried about. Making the report and then having to be there with him still. Because it had happened before. When I was in the shelter, it had happened before I got into the shelter. There was a period of a week where I had to stay in the house with him until the police could come and get us out. So I didn't want to be in that position again. So I waited, and then when he was arrested during that time, according to Oprah Winfrey, I had my aha moment when I decided enough was enough, and then I was freelancing at the time. I'm a journalist, and I was freelancing. I was a reporter with one of the daily papers here, and I was freelancing with one of the papers, and I decided to ask them for me to cover anything that had anything to do with domestic violence. And besides that, I started to attend anything to do with it. So when we had something with Lynette Seabrand Sweet, which was concerning amending the Domestic Violence Act. And I particularly it was during the 16 Days of Activism 2017. And I went to that and I stood up and I asked about the electronic bracelets and if no one was seeing the need for it. And I spoke about some of the things I had faced during my trying to get out. And it kind of started from there. And in 2018, the UN coined the 16 Days of Activism Orange the World. And I decided that I would protest fashionably.
So that's why your color me orange.
But no, the hair it changed. I changed my color to orange because for this year 16 days. But from 2018 to now, I've always worn an item of orange, always. And what I do is I post on my status on WhatsApp photos, and I'm promoting Orange the World and promoting standing up against or fighting against gender-based violence and abuse. So I've been doing that. I've been doing that via phone from 2018 to now, and wearing the color orange.
Okay.
But this year, about a few days before the 16 Days of Activism, I decided to, the name came to me, Color Me Orange, and that campaign pushes for the three needs that I think are fundamental towards, if not eradicating, then decreasing the number or the incidence of domestic violence or gender-based violence in my country. Or in any other country, because I think it's applicable wherever it's needed.
So you've said, Valdeen, that your ex-husband
Mhm.
was your abuser. Could you tell us briefly about when you first experienced violence at his hands and some of the forms that it took during your marriage?
I was slapped within the first year of my relationship. So experiencing violence at his hands came within the first year. Actually, it wasn't within the first year. I found out I was pregnant within the first 9 months, and my son was 7 months old when I was slapped. I had worked about an hour overtime at a restaurant against his wishes. Um, what I remember I had a little pearl earring in my ear and it flew out. It was public. It wasn't public. It was at the entrance of the home of the babysitter. Um, the street was dark. I remember looking around to see if anyone had seen, and I remember crying and him showing some remorse, but still saying that I had pushed him to it. But he had been verbally abusive from almost the start of the relationship. And he had told me once if he had never jealous, then he didn't love. That was his words. If he didn't show jealousy, then it meant he didn't love me. I was 19 and young and living in Point Fortin and looking for an escape out of Point Fortin, and he presented that because he was from Port of Spain. Throughout the marriage, the level of physical abuse increased and it worsened. I was dealt several slaps, punched, tapped. I had black eyes probably at least 3 or 4 times. Um, he told me once one thing he prided himself on is that he had never kicked me. He also told me in detail how he would kill me if I left. Some of the terms he used was that he would light me a fire, which meant dousing me with some flammable liquid or agent and striking a match. He said he would limb me, which meant cutting off my limbs, that he would bury me up to my neck in a hole, leave me there, and nobody would find me. So these are some of the things. I know now that those were words that was meant to instill fear, and it was manipulative. And it did the job. Um, One of the 3 worst injuries I had would have been a headbutt, which left me with 7 stitches here. Well, actually, it's 4. And he hit me once with a Lucozade bottle. That's a glass bottle, and it broke. So I have just on the edge of my hairline, I have a spot that the hair didn't grow back, just a slash. And he tried to run me over with a vehicle once, but a palm tree took the more of the impact of the lash of the vehicle. That same night, I was so upset. It wasn't far from where I lived. I went back into the car because he said, get into the vehicle. He mashed up my phone that night. And I went back into the vehicle. We drove the short distance away to our home, which was on the corner of a busy street. And it was, I think, a Friday, and it was lively. And he was never a quiet person. So I think he liked having an audience. So if we quarreled, neighbors knew, villagers knew. Um, and I was always the one trying to mediate or trying to talk him down. So I remember parking in front of the house and trying to calm him down from inside the vehicle. And he's outside at the front of the vehicle. And I'm asking him to, I'm trying to reason with him because of the quarrel, and he wasn't hearing it. And he went into the gate first, and then I went inside. My children were inside, and I was so upset. I went into the kitchen, I took a glass bottle and a knife, and I said I was fed up and finish it. And I thought in that moment when I said finish it, he would see the hurt, or he would see, it would probably shock him, but it did the opposite, and he slashed me with the knife on just above my right elbow. And my daughter, I can't remember how old my eldest daughter was at the time. Up to this day, she says she recalls saving my life twice. And that was one of the moments when she rushed between us. And I think that is what stopped him from maybe cutting me again or stabbing me at that time.
So
And
you'd say then, Valdeen, that the forms of abuse, level of violence increased over the years.
yeah, significantly. And coming down to the last maybe 5 years, he had gotten to a point where I think he didn't care. He said it to me, and he showed it also. The tears or reasoning with him only fueled his anger. He felt like I would use tears against him. My Christianity was another thing that he quarreled about, because in his words, if I tried to defend myself or I got angry, then he would say, "What kind of Christian woman he is?"
Mm. So, what would you say, Valdeen, led you to, or at what point would you say that you sought the intervention either of the police, or the courts, and would you say that you think you got justice as you sought to get help from the police and from the courts?
Well, in the first instance, the very first time I even thought about um, making a report or anything, it was when I suffered the headbutt. But he went to the hospital with me. When I told him in the vehicle, and we stopped a vehicle, and when I told him I was going to go to the police station, he hit me in the vehicle, but it was someone he knew, and the guy said to him if he could stop doing that in his vehicle, because I was still bleeding. I was bleeding a little bit still. And we got to the hospital, and a police officer came in with a prisoner, someone in handcuffs, and he spoke at the police and he said, "Make sure and spell my name right, but I will come out." And when I went into the doctor's room, he asked me how did I get the injury, if I was in a fight, was male or female. And I asked him if I wanted to press charges, if it's bailable. And he said yes. And I told him a female. So I never reported that. And I never reported most of the things or incidents in maybe the first 15 years of our marriage or relationship. And I actively really sought the police in 2011 when I had he had punched me in my face, and I had a black eye, and my son saw it, and he said to me, "The kill is that." And and in talking to him, I found out that he had also been abusive to them when I wasn't around, and that's what decided it for me. So I called 100 Save, domestic violence hotline. I called a friend first. She told me to call in at Brand Sweet. She knew she was an attorney fighting for women's rights, and I didn't get on to Miss Sweet. I think she was out of the country, and then I called back my friend, and she said, "Call domestic violence hotline." I thought about it for a while because I was still thinking if they would be able to protect me from him, and then I called because I thought about my children first. However, the focus then had been on the abuse to the children, and the domestic violence report was I've never been to court for domestic violence with my ex-husband. Never.
So,
They
so, you're saying that the police involvement and going to court has been pertaining to abuse against your children?
Yeah, the focus at that time when I told them certain things, they assigned me a victim support officer, and they helped me to get that. When I spoke about the 1 week that I stayed in the house, afraid, that was that period of time. They had to, because in courts in Trinidad and Tobago, I don't know about other countries, to charge someone for whatever, yeah, they don't just arrest one time according to the charge. So what they asked me if he had any prior warrants or anything, so they could get him on that and then get us to safety, and then they could press the charges for whatever abuse was happening.
Okay.
And I told them about a fine that he had, and they arrested him for that unpaid fine. But that was like a temporary, it's like a time allowed TOC or something like that. It's called TAC.
Okay. Did you
So
get a protection order at
not
any point in time?
not at that time. No, not at that time. And 6 weeks later, I was back with him. Um, but because the concentration had been on the abuse to the children, so we now had a matter in court at that time with the children. And even on the extract that I took from that case, there was nothing about domestic violence in that in those charges. He was just charged for abuse we had said he had done to the children, and their statements were taken. My statement was taken. And then when I got the extract, the matter was thrown out 2014, and it said no show absence of the complainant. And I thought it was me at the time. I thought I was the complainant, and I thought I had caused the case. But by that time, we were back living together. So I wasn't going to court. He alone was going to court. He would just tell me the days. And I went back too because while I was in the shelter, his boss, who had called and begged not to take him out, not to pay the fine, he paid it for him. And my ex-husband called me on the phone while I was in the shelter, and he apologized. And I was a Christian wife at the time, and I felt that I should not have condemned him. So he said he needed help, and I thought I got help for him through a church in South. And the first time I broke the rules of the shelter was to go to church with him. So I met him in church and kind of saw what I wanted to see, which was a glimpse of the God-fearing man or husband that I wanted to have. And then I moved back in with him, and then we had, the thing about it is I can't remember the good times, I kind of, some of it, but it's overshadowed by so much turmoil that came with the domestic violence because he gambled. So we faced a lot of evictions, a lot of relocations, sometimes serious poverty, even though I was always working. And then I continued when I came out of it, and then I moved back in. We stayed like that for some time. The matter was thrown out in 2014, and then in 2016, I'd seen little glimpses of him being abusive to the children, but I would ask them about it, and the matter was thrown out, and life kind of went on for 2 years as normal as we had moved. No, I'm wrong. I had a mistake there. That was 2011. So while the matter was going on in 2013, we had a bit of a falling out because of the child protection unit and the matter with the children and the abuse. He was ordered to stay away from us at a certain distance. So
Okay.
it,
So
it was
you had
something
a
like, it was
court
a court
order
order. Yeah.
mandating him to stay away.
Yes. Yes. It was a court order, not a protection order. So I didn't have to apply for that because we had the court order. So what he did is he stayed in a village away from us. So he was still really close by. And
So,
he would
sorry.
come he would come across whenever the children were in school. So
Okay.
he found ways to navigate around and
Around the order.
I did not try to, I didn't think I could tell him no. I didn't think I could tell him don't come. The court says that because he never accepted that I could be anything but his ally, even when he was wrong.
Mm. So, all right, let me let's go back a little bit, Valdeen. So you said that you got a court order which mandated him to stay away from you and the children. Could you tell us a little bit about your experience in the court setting? How was it for you? And do you feel like your interaction, were you satisfied with your interaction with the court system? Do you feel like it helped you to get justice?
Okay, so, well, the court order wasn't for me because they never treated with the domestic violence. The court order was for the children. So, and because of that, I don't think at the time it was addressed at all. Because I went into the police station with my entire left face blue black. I had taken pictures. So they knew that he had injured me, and it was 1 week old, so it was showing. And I did give a statement regarding the abuse, and then nothing was ever, as far as I know. When I was in the shelter, they allowed me. Now the rules of the shelter usually is to take the phone away to limit the victim having any connection with the abuser. But because I told them he had confessed certain things to me regarding the children, they asked me to get to continue to speak to him. So I did. And also the church had told me they had an inspector that was willing to sit with him for him to give a statement. An inspector from their church is a police officer, but he attends that church, and he's a senior in the church. So my ex-husband had asked me, even after he admitted to some of the abuse towards the children, he asked me to not condemn him. So he said he would have been willing to confess, but that it would be based on the fact that I didn't turn my back on him, so that he would still have his family. And because the church was telling me restoration and not divorce, and that he had joined the men's meeting. This is while I was in the shelter. He had joined the men's meeting, the men's group, and he was attending church with them. And that anybody could change, and just put it in the hands of God. And I followed that. And the police, the victim witness, and the police allowed me to keep in contact with him so that it could be arranged for him to come in to give the statement. But none of the focus was ever on what he had done to me. It was only on the children. So I didn't feel then at all that anything was done pertaining to keeping me safe. And I think I needed someone to ties between us, because I couldn't do it on my own with him. And then we went to court. I never went to court. In that, for the matter with my children, I never went to court. He continued to go to court. And I wanted to go to court with him, and I remember him asking me not to go to court because he didn't want the police, because my children had to stay in a home when I was in the shelter. 4 of my children stayed in a home. The last one was with me. She was 9 months old, and my eldest son, because shelters do not take boy children over a certain age in this country, I had to get a friend to keep my son, the eldest boy. So we were split up.
So the instances, Valdeen, where you went to court, there were were any of them in relation to violence against you, or were these solely in relation to the children?
The only time I ever went to court with him for pertaining to me was still kind of directly linked to the matter, because in 2016, when I came out and I made the report that I made wasn't even for me. The report I made was the abuse had worsened as far as my children. So I went into Child Protection Unit and I made a report, and it took a while for them to charge him because he was already in prison for robberies. And they told me they would have to charge him habeas corpus. So they had to write to the prison to be able to get an interview with him to be able to charge him for the new charges, which was child abuse. So they did put fresh court orders on that one again, that he had to stay away from us, but it included me now. The second court order included me. This was in 2017. He was charged in July 2017. And this time I went to court. I went to court and I was appalled at the justice system and the court. I remember coming out of court and crying many times because it felt so much like the court was on his side.
Why did it feel to you?
For one, the first investigator for Child Protection Unit, he took our statements. He told me because of the first matter, he would stress to the magistrate the need to see that there was a first matter of child abuse and that it should at least determine was the outcome of bail and all of that, because I was begging them for no bail. Because he was arrested in the home, so he knew where we lived. He knew where my children went to school, and I was begging them to give him no bail on that charge, so that at least I would get some time to regroup or relocate or do something. And they unfortunately they transferred that officer to another district, and I got a new officer just about before he was to be charged. And I had gone to the station in December 2016, and he wasn't charged for the child abuse until July 2017. And that was because they said they had to get the letters to the prison to charge him while in prison and all of that. So it took some time. And all that time he was calling my phone. He was between threats and begging and asking for forgiveness and threats. And then in 2017, just before he was to get charged, I kept on it, calling the station, finding out why isn't he charged yet. They said the easiest way to charge him would be in transit to court for the robbery matter, so that they didn't have to wait for the approval of the prisons commission to charge him in prison. So they had to work out a way to charge him either on the way back or in the court for the robbery matters, which is what was supposed to happen.
So let me ask you then, what would you say are some of the shortfalls in the system? So from your vantage point, so whether it is you're talking about policing or based on your interaction with the court system, what would you say, in your view, are some of the ways in which you would say the system fell short?
Well, for one thing, I think definitely they need to start to assess persons who are accused of abuse at the court level, so that they can determine how much of a danger they are to victims or survivors who remain outside and could be in danger. And I say that because even to apply for a protection order, I don't think the victim should be left. It should be left up into the hands of the victim alone. What I do know is that they have amended the Domestic Violence Act last year, and it was some of the amendments was mentioned recently in a Zoom I was in, and I was heartened to hear some of the amendments were related to the shortcomings before. So they've fixed some of the things so far. As far as who can apply for protection orders, how you can apply for it, it's less of a hassle to apply for it now. The requirements are less now to be able to qualify for one. Police officers can now make application on behalf of a victim. Those are things that wasn't in before. And for me, getting my first protection order was frustrating. It was in 2018. He had just come out of prison for the robberies, and he was now he got out on the robberies were dismissed, and he came out on bail for the charges of child abuse. So he was outside, and I was afraid, and I went in to get a protection order. And first thing the JP said is that he has to have threatened you within the last 6 months, but I had changed my number. So he could not have called me to threaten me, but we had been hearing. Since he came out, he had driven through my community. So persons had told me they saw him in my village. And I know that was scare tactics. It was meant to intimidate me, so I went to get a protection order. I didn't want to lie to her, so I could not tell her that he had made a verbal threat to me in the last 6 months. I told her he didn't make any since, but he was a threat. Also, another thing, she said I had to have a direct address for him. And I didn't have an address. I had the area he was living in, but I did not have like a light pole number or a building number. So it took me, I left without a protection order. I did not get a court hearing. And but I started to message the commissioner of police privately. I started messaging officers who had befriended. I continued to cover events related to domestic violence domestic violence. And I went to a march against domestic violence, and I spoke to the leader there, and she called an officer, and we started to speak, and that officer arranged for me to speak to an inspector in the station that I'd been making reports in. And he is the one who walked me through getting my protection order. He actually went to court with me for me to get a protection order. And I got the first protection order. It did not cover the children. It was only for me. So I had the court order that covered, that said he was not to contact either myself or my children, either directly or indirectly. It had five conditions for bail. And those conditions would have affected his bail in the sense of if he breached them, they could revoke his bail. And I really thought that I knew him to the point where I know one day he would. I knew that one day he would. And then I was sadly disappointed again by the justice system. Because in 2020, he started a new relationship, and that person, he became violent towards her. And a relative of hers reached out to me. And eventually the young lady was put in a home, in a shelter. And when she was placed in that shelter, he called my phone. And I'm trying to remember how he called my number. I think he got my number through someone, through a relative, through one of his relatives, which were my in-laws. And he called and he asked me if I was too comfortable. And at some point in time, he was crying on the phone and saying I wanted to take away his joy, which was his girlfriend. And maybe we're too comfortable where we are. And if he hadn't left me alone for how long?
So you read that as a threat?
Definitely, it was a threat.
Oh, okay. So
this is someone who had called me from in the prison and threatened to kill our children one by one. So yes, that was a threat.
Oh, okay. So were there any consequences? Did anything?
Yes, I made a report. I made a report to the police station. I recorded him, and I made a report to the station. And when I went to the station, on the receipt they put information, and they told me to. I think he said come back the next day. I got the receipt. I left, or he said someone would contact me, and I didn't feel satisfied. So I went to the main police station. I got to speak to a sergeant who said to me, because what I was telling them in the first station was that the Bail Act had been passed. And the Bail Act said that the court order I had, because by that time my protection order had expired, and I was unable again to get one because of the system. I was told the 6 months thing, because I didn't have an officer accompany me. I went back for myself.
Did you have a lawyer?
No.
When you're seeking?
No.
Okay.
I did I did have an attorney, because when I felt that the child abuse case was going, it was just lagging and just being adjourned. And even how he was arrested was really, really something else, because a an officer messaged me and said the robbery case had been thrown out and he would be released today. And the warrant was in a station for him to be charged with the child abuse, but the court that he was in didn't know about the warrant. So I had to inform the court in Central that the warrant was out in the East for the child abuse, and they rearrested him that same day. So I had little faith in the system at the time, because it wasn't, nothing was, there didn't seem to be any networking or any communication between courts or stations or anything like that. And then when he called and he threatened me, I didn't have, no, actually, because of that lag in the child abuse case, what I did is I contacted someone in the justice system and I told them all that was happening, and they said, go to the DPP's office. And I went to the DPP's office and they assigned me a state attorney for the child abuse matter. So we do have state counsel for that matter. And they had been, all of my fears they listened to, and they would have called the prison from time to time to verify if he was still in prison. Upon my request, they came to court, and if the assistant DPP couldn't come to court, she sent an attorney to represent. Whenever he made threats, if he did call my phone before I changed my number, they tried to revoke his bail once when he did threaten. When he made threats over the phone, he denied it. Well, they took me out of the court. When they made the application to revoke his bail, they told me I had to come out of the court. And the police officer with the child abuse matter, he stayed in court. And then I was told, well, he said no, he denied ever calling me. And there's no way to verify that he called, because you're not supposed to have a phone in the prison anyway. So
it sounds to me, Valdeen, like you've had a mixture of significant moments of both frustration as well as assistance, both in terms of dealing with the police as well as dealing with the court system.
Yes, because there were pluses and minuses throughout the entire journey. But the minute I decided I wanted to come out and that he was to be accountable, there were pluses and minuses, because the officers that I felt I had no faith in became my friends, and in the sense of they became the ones that I could go to or call or go to the station to make a report. But the justice system had that flaw that I will never forget, because when he contacted me, the court order is still in place. It's in place up to this day, because the child abuse case that he was charged for in 2017 has never been to trial yet.
Okay.
And this is 2021 into 2022.
He contacted you and there were no consequences.
Right, and I made a report and they arrested him. It took a while, and they arrested him. And when I thought we were going to court and his bail was going to be revoked, I was in court. He was in handcuffs in the prisoner's docks, and then the magistrate said, I had the police who charged him was there, and then I heard the magistrate say bail and surety.
And that took you by surprise.
Yeah. I almost got contempt of court because I wanted to scream. Because I could not believe that she was going to release him. Bail and surety meant he was coming out that same evening. Right. He just had to wait downstairs for them to process his paperwork, and I stood up and I asked if I could say something, and then I asked, could you please explain to me what does that mean? But I waited until they carried him out, because I still had some little fears for him. Being in the same room with him kind of causes some reaction. So he left and they carried him back out. He was kind of smiling because it had worked in his favor. And then when I asked the magistrate, and she said, yes, ma'am, you can speak. And I said, could you please tell me what does that mean? And she said, well, they'll process his paperwork and he will be released because he pled not guilty.
Okay.
He said it wasn't him on the recording, because the magistrate, I think she made mention that there may be evidence that he did. There may be evidence that he did contact me, and he said, well, no, that's not true. And she said, well, okay, she advised that he get an attorney, and she adjourned it, and then she said bail and surety, and it was the amount that he could be released the same day. And then I asked her, I said, but he knows where I live. He knows where my children goes to school, and we have had incidents where he went by the children's school. He has been seen in my village. What am I supposed to do? Do I relocate tonight? And she said, I can go downstairs and apply for an interim 21-day court order, protection order. And I said, but ma'am, isn't there a court order? With all due respect, there's a court order. He was brought in because of the court order. And as far as I know, that can cause his bail to be revoked. And she said that the matter of him breaching the Bail Act is now a matter. It has to go through the channels of the court before they could revoke his bail. So I said, and I'll be honest with you, had I known that that was going to be the case, I would not have gone ahead with it. Because how I saw at that time, because I felt like the system was working in his favor, I anything that led his attention to me felt like I was going to trigger him to come at me. So by the police arresting him for something that related to me, it just felt like I was putting myself in danger. I just didn't want any connection with him. So once he stayed away from me, I was okay. And even if he did, I remember once the police asking me if I wanted them to warn him. That's when he called from in the prison with the death threats. No, he was outside. And we went to court, and he sent a message with my daughter that he would arm himself with a gun and go on a rampage. And when my daughter told me that, I went to the station, and they said because I had no protection order at the time, that their hands were tied, that they could not even arrest him. The most they could do is warn him. And I said, well, then don't do anything. Because if you warn him, it's a trigger. It will bring his attention back to me, and I didn't want that. So I left it alone. That's why I didn't make some of the reports also.
Okay, understood. So the last thing I'd ask you, Valdeen, is, so what would you want for lawyers to know or to do in working with survivors of domestic violence? So this is as your opportunity to speak to them. What would you want them to know or to do?
Okay, for attorneys and court prosecutors, because I was a court reporter once, and I saw where prosecutors in the court stood up and objected to bail or spoke on behalf of the victims, or in terms of once they had the tracing and the person had a record or matters pending, they could ask for no bail. So if the victim didn't have a lawyer per se, then I would like to see the court prosecutor, as well as any attorney representing the victims, to look more closely at the history of the person. If that could be used to apply or to demand no bail, or it could be used to offer some level of better protection for victims and survivors as far as domestic violence or gender-based violence, then I think that needs to be looked at really, really closely. And if there were any matters before that were related, because he had been charged before for child abuse, and this was a new court matter for child abuse. And mind you, for the charge, it was before the same magistrate in two different courts, but apparently that magistrate had been transferred, and it was now before the same magistrate from the first matter. So all of that, I think, needs to be taken into consideration by the entire justice system, even the magistrate. Because if you have in front of you a person that was charged a couple years ago for child abuse with the same children, and then he comes again before the court for child abuse with the same children, then something, even if it doesn't spark a memory in the moment, then I think if you're saying for tracing, then somebody ought to be doing some research. And if that is the court prosecutor or the attorney on behalf of the victim, then I think that needs to be done. It may create some more paperwork and some more time at a desk, but if it means saving a life, then I think it needs to be done. Because that's how I felt. I felt that at certain times I felt like, I think I'm going to represent myself, yes, because they're not what they're doing. That's how I felt. I had to bite my tongue in court so much because I felt like, didn't you so watch Perry Mason? It just felt so frustrating seeing so many decisions in the court to move in zigzag when it could have been a straight line. That's how I felt. And that's to some extent, I still feel like that. That's why the Color Me Orange campaign is to mandate counseling for abusers and assess them at the court, and also to establish a batterers intervention program, because we only look at the abused. We never look at the abuser. The only thing we look at the abuser to do is to imprison them if we have enough evidence and if the court hearing goes according to plan. But other than that, they don't look at breaking the cycle of abuse. We need less victims, less survivors, and maybe less advocates too.
Thank you. Thank you so very much, Valdeen, for sharing with us about your many experiences and about your work now as a human rights advocate. Thank you so very much.